Thank you all, and thank you all for coming. So, as Kate just said, I'm Alex Cabaret. I'm Senior Director for Partnerships at Devex, and I'm happy to welcome Andrea Lucard to the stage. So, Andrea, warm welcome to you, and thank you for being our innovation partner today. And we'll continue on the topics of inclusivity and equity, and women's health. Not specifically.
I want to continue on menopause, Alex. Let's keep going there. Does anyone have a fan?
I'm gonna say.
I see you have one.
That'd be fun. That'd be fun one for me to moderate. And maybe I'll sit down with Kate right after the session so she can prep me for the session on menopause right after that. That's a topic I'm not too expert on, but thank you so much for being here with us and talking about really breaking the barriers. The power of inclusive R&D to accelerate malaria elimination. So, and we've heard a lot today about inclusivity and equity in women's health, so we'll continue on that. Before we get there, I'd like to do a quick intro of Medicines for Malaria Venture, so just some facts that I found impressive. So you have assembled a portfolio of 65 anti-malarial medicines. 15 of them have been used and are used by patients that have saved almost 14 million lives. So all of it starts with R&D. And I want to talk about a resolution that has been passed last year at the World Health Assembly, because we hear a lot about resolutions that are being discussed and sometimes passed at the World Health Assembly. So last year, an important resolution has been passed on clinical trials. So I want to know what it is, what happens when a resolution passes, and how it has impacted your work, or how do you hope it might impact your work and the outcomes of R&D in the context of malaria specifically.
Thank
we can
you.
Start with that. Yeah.
Yes. First of all, thanks for having me, and I'm very happy to meet with people afterwards to share your fan. The clinical trials resolution at WHA is a very important resolution that passed, and it came. It's been in the making for quite a long time, but the COVID-19 experience really drew attention to the world about the need to effectively work together and make sure that we have efficient and effective clinical trials, and that those clinical trials actually reach the populations that will be affected by medicines and vaccines that are for which the medicines and vaccines will be used. In COVID-19, we saw both in low and middle income countries, but also in high income countries, that the practice of inclusion was less than optimal. Pregnant women, amongst others, were excluded from clinical trials frequently, or not allowed until much later to be part of the clinical trials. We also found duplication all around the world, and it's a real waste of resources, in addition to not necessarily being the most effective areas where we can go. We expect that this coming year that there will be new guidance on best practices for clinical trials, and this will include two things, we hope. The one will be the what are we doing, which populations are we reaching, how are we going to do it, and the second one will be how are we doing it. How are we working in low and middle income countries, high income countries, to make sure that the people who are most affected by the diseases are in fact going to be the ones conducting clinical trials and sharing data.
All right, so just to put things into perspective, can you tell us how disproportionately pregnant women are affected by malaria, maybe to start with, so to understand what challenges you face in R&D
Sure.
specifically?
Absolutely. So annually, we believe that there are about 130 million women who are exposed to malaria during pregnancy. Malaria is a disease that disproportionately affects children, particularly children under the age of 5, and pregnant women. That partly has to do with the physiology of pregnancy itself, and so both the mother and the unborn child are affected by malaria, can be affected by malaria. The problem that we have in designing and developing medicines for malaria is that it is extremely difficult to find the mechanisms to have pregnant women join clinical trials. So what we have essentially is a vast number of women who are using medicines for which we don't have data as to whether or not they're safe in pregnancy, either safe for prevention or safe for treatment. I would say to all the women in the room that this is in no way unique to malaria. If you look on the side of any medicine bottle that you will look at, you will see that there's likely to be a warning that says, do not use this medicine during pregnancy. That does not mean that there is data to say you should not use this medicine in pregnancy. It generally means that we do not have data as to whether or not it's safe to use in pregnancy. So any of us who have been pregnant and who have used acetaminophen or have used antidepressants or have used antiepileptic or any other medicine are essentially working as test subjects to the safety of these medicines. Now, what we see in malaria is because this is a disease that is widely treated, widely affects women, we need to gather that data, and there are mechanisms that we can gather that data, and that's what MMB is undertaking right now in its Malaria in Mothers and Babies initiative, MIMBA.
Okay, so you were, MIMBA, can you tell us more about this? So you were saying, we were discussing before the session, you were telling me you have to work backwards on some of these drugs, like collecting the data and doing the R&D in a different way, yeah. In a way. But what does this program tackle, and where is it implemented, and what's the expected outcomes of it? Good to know.
In about 2018, I would say, we had a gathering of scientists in our organization and social scientists in our organization, led by some women scientists who looked around and said, we know we can do better. How are we going to do better? And how are we going to do better to serve pregnant women in the most safe and ethical way? So the first thing that we can look at is to know that women are taking anti-malarials. Malaria is a deadly disease, and women are taking anti-malarials, and they're taking them when they're pregnant, often without knowing that they're pregnant. So the very first thing you can do is you can take a look and create pregnancy registries to be sure that medicines are in fact, that medicines that have been used by pregnant women do or do not create other issues such as stillbirth or complications with pregnancy. And that's the first data collection. As my colleague Viveka Koshupska, who was one of the founders of MIMBA, is saying, however, we really are working off of a background of an uncertain number of birth defects and stillbirth and other problems. We have to first gather data in a population, then we can understand women who have taken medicines to see whether or not there are issues, and from there we can actually say, we can de-risk this medicine. We understand that it's unlikely that this has other problems. Start with what's there. We can do this in our own populations as well. So this is what we're doing globally to make sure that when you're taking acetaminophen in your pregnancy, that if you have any kind of side effects, this gets registered. Very important. Second is then you start designing backwards, right? What other medicines do we know are safe? And then you just start designing from the front end. So in drug development, you start with discovery, you start with chemical molecules, right? You just take a look at the chemistry, and you start saying, can we test very, very early to understand whether or not there's likely any teratogenic issues associated with a molecule? So working backwards, what do we have in the marketplace? Can we say whether or not it's safe? With what data? Based on what population? And coming the other way, as we're designing the molecules, what's going to be safe coming forward?
All right, so what kind of stakeholders do you have to engage, or what are the ones that are the less, at least, the ones you need to engage still to make it work faster, or is it just a long process? Anyway?
That's a beautiful question. Which stakeholders do we not have to engage? Just now, the speakers ahead of me were talking about who do you have to engage in a community if you're going to take contraception. All of those people you need to engage. The mother, the woman, the family, the community, who has a stake in healthy pregnancy. All of those people must be engaged. Who else has to be engaged? Well-trained ethicists. How do you make the decision ethically as to whether or not a medicine should be or should not be tested with pregnant women. And we're talking about ethicists in the countries where they're living, right? We're not talking about only northern ethicists deciding for southern ethicists or only eastern and western, right? So trained ethicists. You have to work with regulators. Regulators need to decide whether or not they will accept the data. Statisticians, how many women do you need to have in a trial in order to decide that you have data? Then you need to work with all of the drug development people, so the chemists, the biologists, the clinical trial design. So everyone except for perhaps your refrigerator salesman needs to be involved in this.
All right. What about funding? What's the role of funding in there?
I come out of the fundraising arena, so I would be entirely remiss if I didn't say right now, lots of funding please for Medicine for Malaria Venture. We're doing important work. I will say, though, that funding is not the first problem that we have. The first problem that we have is an attitudinal problem that says women are incapable of making decisions to join in clinical trials. And we cannot do that. We cannot solve this scientific problem. That is not true. It is a thorny problem. And we solve lots of thorny problems. So yes, we need some of these, for example, some of these pregnancy registries take a long time. You have to bring in lots of people. And so funding is crucial, as is mind shift.
Mm-hmm. So that, yeah, we go back to what the panelists just before were saying and what Dr. Yede was saying this morning, that women need to be in the decision-making process and positions to make this work, right? Last, I'd like to ask you for one call to action for the global health community this week. And if you have maybe a few seconds on what do you expect from the new guidelines that will be shared next year by WHO on eliminating malaria, or related to this resolution that passed last year.
So my call to action is for all of us to take this very seriously. We need to be able to overcome these barriers, and we can overcome these barriers to making sure we're gathering data to be sure that our medicines are safe in pregnancy, which is also to say safe for women of reproductive potential. And what I most intensely hope will happen and will come from the WHO guidelines is mechanisms and a demand that indeed we provide this kind of research. There's nothing like that to make sure that we focus our minds.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrea. Nice, very nice to have you, and thank you again for supporting this event. For those who want to meet with Andrea, she's here. You can meet later outside the room, and Viveka is also in the room here.
Some of my other colleagues.
Okay, I'd like to welcome Rumbi back to the stage.